I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window. Open it and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore." Freedom is the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. We have now sunk to a depth at which the restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent men. George Orwell. There can be no liberty for a community which lacks the information to detect lies. Walter Lippmann, journalist and social philosopher, 1919. What follows is edited from the first 12 hours of television news broadcasts by BBC, CNN, and Fox on 9/11. Behold, the treasonous Zionist PR campaign to get the U.S. to commit war crimes begins.
The entire apparatus of the United States government, FBI, national security, CIA, the vice president, who you may remember was placed in charge of a domestic terrorism study group within the White House to monitor and develop plans to deal with a catastrophe of just this kind.
It's one of those targets that is at the very heart of how our system works. And if you can shut down the stock market in addition to creating a high loss of life, then you can bring extraordinary publicity to whatever your cause is. I don't think that this is the kind of terrorist attack that the United States will take quietly. I think it's basically amounts to a declaration of war, and I think it will be seen that way by the Bush administration.
War is a racket. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group knows what it's about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. Major General Smedley Butler, 1881 to 1940.
And if we find the governments have harbored or supported the terrorists in any way, I think those governments become extremely vulnerable at that point.
Wouldn't it be likely that you could eliminate many of the smaller groups and concentrate? Could this be, in fact, the act of a government, an adversarial government, Iraq, Libya, some of the other countries that we have long suspected of supporting this type of terrorism, rather than the act of a cell, Hezbollah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, that sort of thing?
Well, it is, of course, always possible. I don't think it is probable, because for a government to become involved in something of this size and symbolically so important that resonates throughout the world and definitely represents an attack against the U.S. would obviously mean putting itself into the category of rogue states against whom international sanctions can be mounted and life can become very difficult and unbearable. The support that the U.S. is giving to Israel, both politically and economically and militarily, is at the roots of most probably of what is happening here. The tendency obviously is to be vindictive, to take revenge, to become even harsher. There are already television talk shows saying that we have to give Israel the green light to go in the Palestinian territory and do whatever they want. I think that would be, of course, a serious mistake. I think that what we have to do is to work for an equitable solution that takes into account the interest of different parties here, and also maybe be more innovative in how we deal with these situations that are festering, that are difficult, that are complicated.
You were assessing intelligence, fearing something one day like this might happen. In your National Security Council, is this the doomsday scenario?
Nick, this is about as close to the doomsday scenario as could be contemplated.
19 people hitting 3 buildings and killing 3,000 people is horrifying enough, but it is not a doomsday scenario. In the Cold War, the U.S. had 8,500 nuclear weapons against Russia's 11,000 nuclear weapons. That was a doomsday scenario.
What we are seeing now is nothing less than the worst nightmare that one could imagine come to life, probably worse than anyone could have imagined. And I hate to say it this way, but this may be the day that America's luck ran out.
And to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. George Orwell.
But I know this is a favorite national pastime of filling up time with conjecture, and there are people who have axes to grind and therefore want to point fingers. I remember the first time the World Trade Center was bombed, a so-called expert said it was the Serbs. And then when Oklahoma City happened, the same expert said it was Arabs, and was wrong both times.
To the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Right, that's the view from the Palestinian side. Joining me now here in the BBC World studio is the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who's in London at the moment. Mr. Barak, welcome to BBC World.
The central message the Zionists needed to push was this is grounds for war and not an international crime to be handled by Interpol, FBI, etc. This, of course, would free up enormous amounts of money, create financial chaos, and shut down critical thinking. Ehud Barak is the most decorated soldier in the history of the Israeli Defense Forces. This Zionist kingpin has been called the architect of 9/11. He works relentlessly on the BBC, telling the USA what to do next.
First, your reaction, having heard what's happened. At least 4 planes have been hijacked, and there may be more.
The world will not be the same from today on. It's an attack against our whole civilization. I don't know who is responsible. I believe we will know in 12 hours. If it is a kind of bin Laden organization, and even if it's something else, I believe that this is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror.
In your position as Prime Minister, Defense Minister, also formerly in the Army, were you ever aware of any incident planned like this?
I'm not sure, but this is not the case. It really happened in front of our eyes, and the question is what should be done in regard to it in order to avoid it in the future. It's going to be a tough struggle. There will be many tough and painful moments along the way.
What can be done? Because the great thing that is talked about by people like you, diplomats, politicians, world leaders, is preventing conflict before it happens. When you talk about a war, how do you take a war to 4 people?
I believe that the world intelligence community, in a concerted effort, can identify within few months the sources of this terror. They can identify the places where they are deployed on Earth. Every such a place is within certain country. The bin Laden sits in Afghanistan. There is a source of terror.
Who else do you identify, though? Because we're not saying he's responsible for this necessarily.
No, we don't say that he's necessarily responsible. We know where other terror thugs are living. We know that Ferganskaya Dolina in Central Asia is a major route for drugs, but at the same time major route for terror. And I know that President Putin is highly committed to the struggle against terror, and I feel that he should be part of this international effort. I believe that the MI6 is highly capable. You have proven it along decades. Your own skills in standing firm politically and acting pointedly, operationally against terror. And we should cooperate with
preemptively?
Both preemptive and by diplomatic means, namely rogue states. There are 5 of them: Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea. These kind of states should be treated as rogue states. And the same applies to even to leaders like Arafat. We've heard him just recently condemning this. I praise him for this condemnation, but he personally is responsible for many terror events that happened in the last few years. Same happened in some other capitals in the Middle East.
But Israeli sources are actually pointing the finger away from Palestinian militant groups and suggesting that they attach some importance to the possibility that the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden was involved.
In a case like this, that's going to lean people towards talking about, Islamic fanatics. But we need to remember that, Islam is a religion. It's a religion with beliefs and not terribly different from Judaism or Christianity. Or they believe in a God of love and justice the same as we do, and they're not all maniacs. And religious tolerance is one of the principles of our country. We need to hold on to that principle very tightly right now, because it's the principles you hold on to when things are tough that really count.
Fair point.
This was an act by a small number of madmen, and madmen don't characterize any part of humanity.
In the long term, what's terribly important is this is not a war won with bombs and with retaliation of Delta forces. It's a war for people's minds, and that is what is really crucial.
What does the word terrorist actually mean? Many terrorists would sooner describe themselves as freedom fighters. Could it be that the charge of terrorism could just as easily be made against Western corporations, speculators and policymakers?
When we talk about terrorism, it means what they do to us, not what we do to them.
The words terror and terrorism are being used to create incredible damage in the world. The definition of terror is the use of fear to intimidate people, especially for political reasons. If terrorism is political, then there are two sides to it. And if that is the case, then both sides could or would be seen as terrorists by each other. How can this word terrorism be in all government documents as policy? It is too ambiguous and leads to irrational, blind emotionalism. These are not good words or targets for government action on behalf of the people. It seems more like going to war with ghosts or sinners. An international police action would have been more effective and lawful than wholesale murdering everyone who stands up to or criticizes us.
Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif said in reaction to the news of these terror attacks in the United States, and I am quoting, "We want to tell the American children that Afghanistan feels your pain, and we hope that the courts find justice."
America is reaping what it sows in oppression and implanting vengeance in the hearts of those who've been wronged by the oppression and corruption. However, in principle, we do not support attacks against civilians or innocents.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world today. It is perpetrated by fanatics who are utterly indifferent to the sanctity of human life. And we, the democracies of this world, are going to have to come together to fight it together and eradicate this evil completely from our world.
Whoever carried this out isn't interested in making claims of responsibility. Presumably, if they did it for religious motives, well, God knows they've done it. So there's really nothing else to prove. The fact is that we knew then, and the new administration knows perfectly well, that there was this animus out there, this fury that had already generated very dangerous conspiracies against the United States. And there was an understanding, and there is now, or there was up until the minute before this attack took place, that this animus represented a huge threat. The question really was what you do to defend yourself.
Sitting in that seat about an hour and a half ago was Ehud Barak, the former Israeli Prime Minister, and he said to me he saw this as a war on civilization. And I challenged him on this. He said we must launch a war in return.
War, a massacre of people who don't know each other for the profit of people who do know each other but don't massacre each other. Paul Valéry, French poet and critic, 1871 to 1945.
There was an emergency press conference called by the Taliban ambassador in Pakistan
he wanted an urgent message to be delivered to the American people. He said that Afghanistan felt their pain and hoped the terrorists would be caught and brought to justice and to trial. Now, this is urgent because 3 years ago, America bombed targets in Afghanistan following the attacks on 2 of their embassies in Africa, and the Taliban clearly want to try and forestall any American wrath that might be directed towards them or directed towards Osama bin Laden.
Now, we are not apportioning blame in any way, and no one's claimed responsibility, no one's pointed a finger. But was any question asked about Osama bin Laden, who of course is on sovereign Afghan territory?
Yes, the ambassador said that Osama bin Laden could not have been responsible. You can see him speaking now. He was very clear about this. He repeated the Taliban line that he has no communication equipment with the outside world. Now, this is something that the Americans and others have questioned very seriously. The other thing that the Taliban ambassador said was that he hoped that America would launch a full investigation and reveal its evidence to the world before it made any move.
The Zionist criminal escalation to insanity continues on steroids.
So what I want to stress here is that any nation, and this goes for the Taliban and their henchmen in Afghanistan, any nation in the world that harbored anyone associated with this must be treated as though they were part of what is effectively an act of war against the United States. And they cannot hide behind the traditional definitions of difficulty. And I think starting with Afghanistan, we're going to have to hold everyone accountable.
So we don't simply, in this conversation, we don't simply hold the group itself, whoever it is, the group itself accountable. We hold anyone accountable, any country, any government accountable, if they did nothing to stop it.
And if the Taliban shelters Osama bin Laden, as they do, and if Osama bin Laden is responsible for this, as I think almost everyone is going to suspect, then the Taliban must be held equally responsible for what has happened today.
How does he know what everyone is going to suspect? The event just happened a few hours ago.
And Ambassador Holbrooke, I would like you to be specific. What does that mean? Are you talking about a retaliatory strike against Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's Jeff.
It's Jeff Greenfield. I'm sorry,
Hi, Jeff. No.
Is that what you mean? That if put the links together?
No, Jeff. Let me be very frank, and I don't want to lapse into bloody-minded verbal excesses at a moment of high emotion. But let's be very blunt about this. If a country or regime, the Taliban or some other regime to be determined by the intelligence community, has sheltered people who played a role in this, they cannot hide behind the attributes of they didn't know it, they had nothing to do with it. And if, in fact, these people are in some degree of collusion, I personally believe that the Taliban should be regarded as co-equally responsible for this, and therefore, if and when we consider military action, it is fully justified, and the Taliban should face the same consequences.
Well, let me just give you an update from the Middle East. The Israeli Air Force has been put on high alert following what has happened in New York City and Washington.
Then the next step will have to be a program to attempt to eradicate the source of this and to bring pressure and serious pressure on governments that harbor this kind of organization, and especially governments where we suspect that these organizations are located.
Sir, for a long time, there's been a kind of cat and mouse game, and I don't make light of this in any sense when I say game, between the governments that harbor terrorists and our government, other Western governments. It's all changed today, hasn't it? I mean, the stakes have changed enormously. The response likely will change enormously. It's all different, isn't it?
That's correct. When these terrorists dare to attack the territory of the United States, it then becomes a question of the functioning of our society. And we have to protect ourselves, and I'm sure we will. And it can't be dealt with one retaliatory blow.
It cannot be dealt with one retaliatory blow?
No. There has to be a systemic attack. I don't know what that means.
I understand.
And I'm not sitting here with a great plan. I'm saying this is what I would think our government will want to work towards. This is comparable to an attack on Pearl Harbor, and it must have the same response, and the people who did it must have the same end as the people who attacked Pearl Harbor. But it isn't just the people who did it, it's the people who make it possible.
These are the governments that harbor those who carry out these attacks.
That harbor or encourage them with their propaganda.
Henry Kissinger is the most effective Zionist propagandist in our country's history. The propagandist's purpose is to make one set of people forget that certain other sets of people are human. Aldous Huxley.
You seem to be suggesting that you have fears that America will respond in a very decisive way without necessarily the evidence to back up the reason for hitting the targets they're likely to hit.
I fear that could be the case. It's tended to be the case in the past.
Given what happened in Oklahoma City with Timothy McVeigh, everyone immediately looked to the Middle East.
Yes, I do feel very uncomfortable. And I have to say that although there appear to be strong pressures indicating the Middle East, I still don't feel convinced. One of the reasons is that this attack originated on American territory. It required people to penetrate American security in a country that is acutely sensitive about the Middle East. And it required also enormous coordination. I find that really very difficult to understand.
Mullah Omar is the spiritual leader of the Taliban here, and he's recently issued a short statement. In that statement, he criticizes what he called an act of terrorism, and he was very explicit. He said that Osama bin Laden was not responsible for it, and he said that all he wanted for his country was peace and peace for other countries in the world. And he went on to say that he believed Osama bin Laden could not have been responsible for such a complex act of terrorism. And he also said that if Afghanistan is a poor country, and therefore he believed there was no way that Afghanistan could be involved in such a complicated act of terrorism.
Our position is that if America has evidence and proof, they should produce it. We are ready for the trial of Osama bin Laden in the light of the evidence. Taliban statement.
And when I asked whether there were considerations being given to some sort of retaliation against targets in Afghanistan, one official said, "I wouldn't be planning your vacation there if I were you."
There are few words to describe the depth of this tragedy. It's an attack on the United States that we haven't seen really since Pearl Harbor.
And of course, if one doesn't act, there are always people in the wings, in the Republican Party, screaming for blood, applying the political pressure to any politician to carry out a reckless retaliation.
The most brilliant propagandist technique will yield no success unless one fundamental principle is borne in mind constantly. It must confine itself to a few points and repeat them over and over. Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda minister.
The only one that can save humanity from this terrible danger is the United States of America. You know, only evil people can arrive to such a sophistication, and the measures must be radical as the evil itself. I think what should be done is to identify every country that hosts or supports terror and declare those countries as terrorist countries. I think there must be a call to all religious leaders, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, to condemn fully, without an excuse, all the suicidal bombers, suicidal person who in order to kill others they kill themselves. It's against the basis of our life, it's against the gospels of every believer. And then again we have to organize ourselves globally, because we are going over from a world of enemies where you have had armies to face them to a world of global dangers that we don't have yet neither a strategy nor an army to stop it. we have to get ourselves organized properly and fully and immediately. Permit me to say that today each of us feels American, like an American, with all the seriousness, all the pains, and all the determination.
And none of the respect for international law.
The whole of Congress has been evacuated. A number of senior congressional figures are calling this America's Pearl Harbor.
Ehud Barak is back for the fourth time on the Zionist-owned BBC. This sick Keller now has two helpers, but this time there is some solid moral opposition.
Mr. Barak, first of all, should we see this as an act designed to draw attention to what is happening in the Middle East, or should we see it as something quite separate from that?
It's clear that the whole Western civilization is at war with world terror. It might have some kind of indirect relationship to something that happened either in Afghanistan or somewhere else in the Middle East, but this is not the case. Once they are ready to hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, it means that we are basically at war. And I'm fully confident American people, which is a tough and courageous people, and have tough leadership at the helmet, they will know how to fight back, and I believe that leaders all around the world, here in the UK, in Europe, in Russia, the Russians will fully cooperate with this. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Israel, of course, and others should join hands to defeat terror, period. We cannot afford this kind of threat to our whole way of life.
I'll come back to that point in a moment. I want to bring in Frank Gaffney, who's the director of the Center for Security Policy, who's in Washington. How do you think the United States will respond to this? And are you surprised, as an expert in security matters, that nobody had any inkling of what happened?
Well, to answer the second question first, I'm not frankly surprised, because this is precisely the way the cells that we're up against here, and perhaps their state sponsors, are organizing themselves and conducting their activities. It is purposely designed to keep the lowest possible profiles, avoid signatures, as they say in the intelligence business, and conduct their affairs in such a way that we won't know what's happened to us until it has happened. As to how the United States will respond, it remains to be seen, of course. My hope is that, as any number of people have said on this program and elsewhere here in Washington in recent hours, the United States is at war now. And I hope that the President will respond appropriately and accordingly. This is not a matter for business as usual, a judicial process, forensic investigations, and believe that we have been struck in a way that is probably going to be a precursor to even worse. And it is time for us to act as I think our friends in Israel have been doing for some time, quite correctly, which is to use such intelligence as we do have, to use such force as we have at our disposal to strike at and try to destroy these terrorists and their sponsors before they strike again.
But do you know who they are?
We probably won't know, if at all, for some time with precision who is responsible for this precise attack. Therefore, I would go after everyone who is engaged in terrorist acts against us, everyone who has made known their determination to do harm to the United States. I think we ought to use this as an opportunity, as has been pointed out by others, to put them on the run. Let them know that they've got no place to hide, and such places that they hide are going to be very difficult places from which to operate against us. I hope the scales are falling from our eyes as a people about our vulnerability in the largest sense. We are, in fact, a target for others' enmity, and they are using the means they have to, and they apparently are going to be a larger and larger set of means with ever more deadly possible effects, including, I have to tell you, missiles that are, I'm afraid, being acquired by some of the same states, some of the sponsors of terrorism, and perhaps even some of the organizations that we're worrying about today.
Agree with this?
Well, I think there's a concern here because we're building a case during the course of this program which leans heavily on the verdict that taking it out in retaliation on Osama bin Laden will be the appropriate way to respond. Now, I imagine that means a bombing raid on Afghanistan. What about all those poor Afghans who have nothing to do with Osama bin Laden and who would not be willing supporters of the Taliban government even in Afghanistan if they had any choice. This means, in the terminology of war, collateral damage. This in itself is not resolution of a problem, it's building more hatred and the perception that the United States wields power without compunction. That is something to be aware of.
Okay, Ehud Barak.
I don't think that the collateral damage is the real issue at stake now. Look at the collateral damage, so to speak, that had happened in the United States.
The term collateral damage originated as a euphemism during the Vietnam War. It refers to the killing of non-combatants and the destruction of their property.
We are dealing with a world effort, not necessarily Osama bin Laden himself. We all know the names of rogue states: Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Gaddafi to an extent, maybe one more. We all know the names of rogue leaders and the name of thugs of terror. And their names are known to the MI6, to the CIA, to the BND, the CM Bureau. And there is a need for joint effort, diplomatic, economic, intelligence-wise, and operation-wise, the same way that our ancestors fought against the piracy on the high seas. No airport and no port terrorists should be allowed to land, and whoever hosts them or directly or indirectly support them should be automatically isolated from the community and family of nations. This is the only way. Without this clarity of purpose, there will be no world order possible, period.
No world order possible, period? He just told us how far he will go to get his way.
Well, we're talking about declaring war, and you're talking about doing it in protection of democracy, and you're talking about sacrificing some of that democracy in the prosecution of that war.
Weapons these days are accurate enough. It's not a matter. I don't want to go into the operational details.
She's talking collateral damage. Example, innocent people dying. He calls this operational details.
Once there is a clear will of world leadership to put an end to it, it will take a lot of painful moments, ups and downs, and even tough moments like this one, but we will prevail and democracies will overcome this phenomena of terror within 10 years.
The simple facts are that national leadership has to establish that terrorism is an illegal act of such magnitude now that it overwhelms the issues of social justice which cause us to quibble.
Any effort to slow down the military option is quibbling.
And restrain us at a time when a crime of this nature has been executed.
You're saying even over individual liberties in some instances?
Well, sometimes yes, and that's an unfortunate statement as an advocate of those very liberties.
So you have to be very careful not to jump to conclusions. And of course in the White House there will be enormous pressure to jump to conclusions and get anybody just to try to resolve the issue.
There can be no real war on terrorism because terrorism is not a strategy, it is a tactic. It is really a criminal activity.
In such moments, cool and reasoned judgment are more essential than ever.
Americans have long wanted to be liked by the rest of the world, and they're incredulous when people don't like them. Most Americans do not understand fundamentally in their hearts the motivation of a terrorist, whether he's from the Middle East or the Japanese Red Army, as somebody on the wires has speculated, to try to do harm to a country that they think wants only to do good in this world. So as a result, they cannot make a connection between America's policies in, for instance, the Middle East and terrorist acts on their own soil. One other generalization. Americans have a tendency to personalize foreign policy. Hence the rush to judgment that it was Osama bin Laden who was behind this. For all we know, this is true, but we don't have the evidence yet.
And remember Oklahoma City.
Remember Oklahoma City, which was initially blamed on Osama bin Laden and other suspects. So there's a tendency to view the world as individuals who are out to do us harm, not as movements, differing opinions, impersonal forces arrayed in opposition to what the United States stands for.
You know, it's like a Pearl Harbor, like a new form of a war, or like a terrible new arm, and we have to take it very seriously. Our hearts is clearly with the people of the United States, but this was not an attack just upon America. It was an attack upon civilization, upon humanity, an attempt to introduce the jungle as the rule of our time and our days. And I think we have to take it very seriously. We are going over from a world of enemies and armies to a world of dangers of a global nature without strategies and without organizations. We have to get ourselves organized. Now, as we feel so deeply with the United States, we know that the United States is determined and strong and will take again the lead to guarantee freedom, to enable people to fly safely, to walk in the streets unthreatened, and really to bring us back to normal life.
Now, as a country, Israel has often been on the receiving end of attacks, although nothing as spectacular as this. What sort of advice would you give to Washington?
To organize it globally in both directions, to identify every country that hosts or supports terror or terrorism, to stop it, otherwise they will be declared as a country of terror with all the consequences. Secondly, to call upon all leaders of religion and culture to stand up and declare themselves against this phenomena of suicidal terror, because it's becoming one of the greatest dangers of our time. It goes against the gospel, and the clergymen have to call each in his own religion to put an end to it.
One final question, Mr. Perez. Many people suspect a Middle East dimension to these attacks. Do you think there's a possibility that American public opinion might want to disengage from the Middle East because they see it as too risky now for America?
I don't think it has to do with the region. It has to do with the form of confrontation and war. There were acts of terror in the United States disconnected with the Middle East, and there are terror in many other places all over the world, including Turkey, including Algeria, including Pakistan. And we have to get ourselves organized not to let small mafias of killers, of cheaters, of liars to disturb life.
What I imagine will happen is if the Americans decide in their own minds that Osama bin Laden was indeed guilty, that they will attack Afghanistan very heavily with missiles, and that perhaps they might target in particular the Taliban government, because bin Laden himself is going to be, I would have thought, almost impossible to hit. He's probably far away in the mountains now. He's got his own communication system, which the Americans can't apparently chip into in any sense. And I think it'll be the hosts that suffer rather than the guest himself.
War against terror is an international war, a war of a coalition of the free world against all the terror groups and against whoever believes that can pose a threat to freedom. This is a war between the good and the bad, between humanity and those who are bloodthirsty. The criminal attack today on innocent civilians in the United States is a turning point in war against international terror. Even if the war against terror is long, and even if the terror will try to raise its head again, there won't be any room in the world in which terrorists, their assistants, and those who send them to be able to find a shelter or a refuge.
This really is a war with terrorism, and we need to be prepared to act as if we are at war, and that does not necessarily mean that you have to strike back only at those that you know were the perpetrators of this thing. And we know a lot of governments that have financed and supported terrorism, and you start with Osama bin Laden, I suppose, and you start with the Afghans.
Well,
but
what can you do, Mr. Secretary?
What you do, and this is what you do, is you strike at them militarily. I mean, I know this is going to sound awful, but my point is there's only one way to begin to deal with people like this, and that is you have to kill some of them, even if they are not immediately, directly involved in this thing.
He wants Americans to agree to bypass international law and kill people not accused of this crime at all.
We think the price is worth it.
So you're not talking about a long, drawn-out investigation as we had with Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, and
I hope
a
not.
long, drawn-out effort to extradite possible suspects.
I hope not. I hope not, because if that's the case, well, you saw what happened with Pan Am 103. I mean, by the time it was all done, first of all, many people had lost all interest in the subject.
This murderous thug just admitted 9/11 is first and foremost about public relations.
This is an act of war. When they compare this to Pearl Harbor, I don't think they're wrong in the sense that it's a surprise attack, and I suspect, if we are wise about this, Pearl Harbor brought the American people together and made us recognize we had something we had to deal with. Perhaps this will do the same thing for all of us.
He sets himself apart as an Israeli firster in his last statement.
Pearl Harbor brought the American people together and made us recognize we had something we had to deal with. Perhaps this will do the same thing for all of us.
And this operation may have been sophisticated enough that people may now start to look hard at whether a government such as possibly Iraq, which is the one government that has praised this undertaking, may be involved. I think the Clinton administration did not look closely enough at that possibility, and hopefully the Bush administration now will. But we should at least take a look at whether there could have been Iraqi involvement in this as well. Well, one thing I hope they learned is that some guidelines that were adopted by the CIA, I hasten to say after I left, those guidelines make it difficult, not impossible, but more difficult than it should be, to recruit spies inside organizations if those individuals have some violence in their background. Well, that may be well and good if you're recruiting spies inside hostile governments. There are a lot of good people trapped inside bad governments. But inside terrorist organizations, the only people there are human rights violators. They're people who want to be terrorists. So if you only recruit nice people as spies, you're not going to learn a lot about what's going on inside terrorist organizations. I think some of those types of guidelines that the CIA operates under now will get a second look. I hope a tough second look.
Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi has just called the incident horrifying, calling on Muslims to help. How do you interpret that statement?
Well, my guess is that there are an awful lot of people around the world that are pretty frightened right now about what the United States is going to do. As you said, this sense of horror is likely to turn to a sense of outrage, and I think the rest of the world, and particularly people that in the past have supported terrorists and given them a safe harbor, and helped them in some way, are probably quite worried at this point about what may be coming against them.
The relentless use of harbor and Pearl Harbor are right out of the Project for the New American Century playbook.
It's clear now, as it was on December 7th, 1941, the United States is at war. The question is with whom? In December of 41 we knew. Today we really don't.
Jim, what are they saying in Tehran about these devastating attacks on Washington and New York?
There's been some very strong condemnation here from President Khatami himself. He described it as a terrorist act which should be very strongly condemned. He expressed great regret and huge sympathy with the American people, especially those who'd been directly touched or bereaved by the tragedies. He went further than that. He said that terrorism should be rooted out by international society, and that Iran itself would spare no effort in that direction. So this is really quite strong words from the Iranian president. The Iranians essentially have taken the line for quite a long time now that all terrorism is to be condemned, and of course they actually berate the Western countries, for some of whom have given sanctuary to the People's Mujahideen, which is an Iranian opposition group based abroad and which has carried out some very devastating attacks in the past here in Iran itself, killing civilians and top leaders and so on.
I think we need to very carefully look at all of the history of these terrorist operations and every shred of evidence that we may have on this one, and see if there's any chance there was state involvement behind it, because indignation and action is not enough.
And remember that this country is a country of laws, and those who oppose us are only countries that do not believe in a system of laws and democracy and the individual freedom.
In the past, Osama bin Laden and other terrorists who do not represent national governments, a distinction which is critically important, but are sheltered in various countries in the world, including Afghanistan, sometimes North Korea, Iraq, Libya, have played this shell game about where the government that shelters them and protects them says, well, we don't know where they are. I heard the interview with Henry Kissinger, and he and I are in full agreement on this. Any government which shelters the people who did this has to be held equally responsible for it as an act of war. And we are going to have to mobilize an international coalition for that position as we prepare to take the necessary military responses. If some countries don't participate, let them understand that they're joining a coalition of terrorists who have declared war on the United States.
Senator Dodd earlier today compared this to the equivalent of the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Right, and you know, he said, I don't think that overstates it. We may find out it will understate it.
Is there some suspicion as well in the U.S. intelligence community that perhaps some government may also have been involved?
Again, it's premature to try to determine who did it and who their collaborators might have been.
So I'm hoping that this is the kind of dramatic, terrible catastrophe that unites the entire civilized world, so that it's not just an attack on the United States, it's an attack on everyone who cares about, freedom and dignity and justice and humanity.
But there basically are four groups that you can imagine having the capabilities of doing this. Bin Laden is certainly one. The others would be some of the more radical Palestinian groups, which might be able to do this. And then, of course, there are two states, Iraq and Iran. And I think that's the list of possible suspects for the moment. We've got some guidelines, some rules that were established in the CIA in the mid-90s that have the effect of deterring case agents from basically trying to engage terrorist spies. And I think this kind of attack shows, again, the importance of intelligence, the importance of taking a very aggressive look at human intelligence.
Well, explain to us why, theoretically, the CIA would put these kinds of rules in effect. Does it make any sense whatsoever not to try to penetrate these terrorist operations?
My own view is that these rules do not make any sense, that in fact if you're going to get good intelligence on terrorists, you're going to have to deal with some very unsavory people. The rules were put into effect because there were concerns at the agency at the time that it was associating the United States with people who might violate human rights or be criminals.
I take it what you're suggesting, the CIA doesn't want to be in the position of having to tell Congress that they're paying these unsavory terrorists?
Well, I think that's probably what led to these guidelines being imposed in 1995. I think that in the wake of this kind of an attack, we're going to have to take a close look at that, and my guess is that those guidelines will be changed. But what we have to do now is find out who did it, and then we have to prepare a retaliation that would, I hope, be the most vigorous military retaliation we can against the people who did it and any governments that were in any way contacted with this, including, if it's in Afghanistan, the Taliban. And I think that the day of sort of talking about terrorism is over now. We've seen the catastrophe that unfortunately many of us have been worried about. It's happened. Tens of thousands of people have been injured and maybe killed, and now's the time for real action. I think it will be interesting to see how many of our allies who are today giving statements of full support, how many of them are really going to be with us when the time comes for retaliation. Then's when we'll know who our real friends are.
America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Terrorists by killing them. And I'm saying to you that that policy of not doing that may have hampered us.
Of
in our
course it's
fight
hampered
against
us.
terrorists.
No, we've been hampered by a lot of new rules. For example, you can't even hire people who have a shady background.
What kind of man is Colonel David Hunt? I think we can talk to him when we line him up and kill him.
We've got to also take care of the country or countries that have supported it. And war has been declared.
Okay.
Now what do you want to do?
Well, as you pointed out, Osama bin Laden is wanted by the United States right now.
Sure.
He's wanted for the Cole bombing. He's wanted for the bombings in Africa. There's no reason on earth why we should not be stalking and hunting down this man right now, just for those things. And then if he's implicated in this, then we have him already.
We've been hunting them. We've been doing all the ball and chain around us. With the people, I know the guys that are doing it. I'm telling you that they have not been. You've already heard where the national intelligence community is prohibited from hiring people or dealing with people that have nasty backgrounds.
Right, that's what Mr. Dunnigan just said.
That
well,
kind of stuff has got to stop.
I think we got to let the chains fall down and let the
Bill, you got
dogs
to unleash
loose.
the dogs of war.
All right.
Of course, the Israelis, who never miss an opportunity for cover, act.
We've just been receiving reports that Israeli tanks have moved into the Palestinian-ruled town of Jenin, that's in the West Bank. The tanks had circled the town earlier on Tuesday and cut off all access roads to it. The Israelis were saying they wanted to prevent possible suicide bombers in the area from getting out and getting into Israel, but now the tanks have actually moved forward and entered the town. That follows, of course, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's speech, his response to the terror attacks in the United States, which he called a turning point in the fight against terrorism, that there should be an international war against the forces of darkness, he called them. And Israeli officials have also been asking the United States or Washington to lead a fight against Islamic militant groups. Now, of course, there's been no claim of responsibility yet or blame assigned for the attack, but Israel would quite like to see its battle against Palestinian suicide bombers and Palestinian militants as part of an international war against terrorism. And if an Islamic militant group is blamed for the U.S. terror attacks, then that might be more likely. This would, of course, be a cause of concern for Palestinians, who would feel then that the Israelis might have a freer hand to use their superior military might against the Palestinians.
I want to underscore John King's point. Richard Holbrooke on our air said, if the Taliban in Afghanistan is shielding bin Laden and he is the one responsible, they must feel the full force of our response. When the President said we will make no distinction between the terrorists and those who harbor him, I think that's very much the point he was making.
In this sense, I do think it's like Pearl Harbor, because it's Pearl Harbor that led us all to come together to defend ourselves against the Japanese. I think this is Pearl Harbor in a sense in bringing us now to look at this terrorist issue as in fact we should look at it, which is if we don't deal with it now, it will be so much worse as the years go on.
But I don't think it's a policy failure. And if by that you mean that it's linked somehow to what may or may not be happening in the Middle East peace process, I would be very leery of making too direct a connection there.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. That casts a fairly wide net of people who might be held responsible for this, indeed people and countries. I wonder if it was a surprise to you to hear the President say those words.
It was. I mean, we have struck at Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, but have not struck at the government of Afghanistan. He seemed to be suggesting, if indeed this turns out to be Osama bin Laden, that he would also strike at the government of Afghanistan, at the Taliban, for harboring him. And that is a great deal more than just going after Osama bin Laden.
Other U.S. intelligence sources that I've talked to in recent years have said that they feel incredibly frustrated because they were following Osama bin Laden for many years. The NSA had tracked him in Afghanistan. They knew where he was at times, but they have their hands tied. They cannot carry out an assassination policy like we've seen here in Israel. At times, Israel does go in and assassinate those that they know are perpetrating attacks against the state of Israel.
Mr. Pearl, people have been talking about this today as an act of war. Is that how you see it?
Clearly, it's an act of war, both in terms of its magnitude and its purpose. Behind these acts of terror are the states that support terrorism. The states that provide the recruitment, the organization, the sanctuary, the planning, the training, the logistics, the money. This could not happen without state support and state sponsorship, and the United States must now do something it has been reluctant to do, and that is hold the states accountable that permit this kind of terrorism to take place.
It's a time for action, not for just interviews. We know the names of these rogue countries. We know the names of the organizations. The intelligence community know to tell us where they are deployed, and it is a time for action, even if it's going to be a very tough and painful and maybe a struggle that will stretch over a few years.
Reports, as I say, of some attacks, explosions in Kabul. You any knowledge of what that might be?
No, I have no knowledge of it, but if it is retaliation against Osama bin Laden, it's long overdue and should be just the beginning of retribution against the state sponsors of terrorism.
Because it's thought that Osama bin Laden, who's been linked to this all through the day, is somewhere in Afghanistan and shielded by the Taliban regime there.
Indeed he is, but he works with other governments as well. And until we come to grips with government support for terrorism, we will be vulnerable to attacks even on this scale. This could not be done without governments that assisted in training pilots, in moving people, in moving resources, and providing intelligence.
I think, as Richard Pearl said a short while ago, if in fact the United States is acting, it's a very welcome and long overdue step. Quite apart from his culpability for this crime, or these crimes I should say, this day of crimes, he is an enemy of this country. He has unleashed attacks against American citizens and property in the past, and there's no doubt, whether he did today's events or not, he would be up to it in the future, and he should be stopped. And those who are making common cause with him, who are sponsoring him, who are protecting him, who are permitting him to train in their countries, or otherwise making possible the kinds of sophisticated attacks he certainly has perpetrated in the past, should also be punished.
Richard Pearl, do you believe that there is a strong case for, if this is what it is, a missile attack on Afghanistan based on what's happened today?
Well, indeed. The fact is that bin Laden is permitted by the authorities in Afghanistan to operate from their territory. And I hope and believe that the United States will now adopt a policy of taking action in response to terrorist attacks against countries that facilitate and support terrorism, against countries like Iraq and Iran and Syria and Sudan and others, because until they pay a price for the support they give to terrorism, they will continue to enable acts of terror on this scale, and we must find a better way to cope with it than the policy of chasing down the individual terrorists.
Attacking everyone is not a better way.
Bin Laden, who is behind this very attack, when you and the whole world will realize the death toll that had been paid in this event, it will become beyond any doubt of anyone on earth in the free world that a concerted attack against her should be taken, whether it's bin Laden or not. Bin Laden had done enough to justify what he might suffer in the future, and the same applies to the Hezbollah, to the Islamic Jihad, to the Hamas, to the whoever is ready to host these kind of activities should be automatically isolated from the community of nations and be treated as a rogue state, and every group of terrorists headed by whoever is there should be dealt with.
It's because he's made the World Trade Center his target before. It's because he bombed the American embassy in Kenya. He bombed the American embassy in Tanzania, and he's made clear that he was responsible for the coal, probably. So he's made all these very targets his targets. And if today we find out that they've been attacked, I don't think it's highly speculative to focus our attention on Osama bin Laden.
But Richard Pearl, isn't a strike back at Afghanistan politically dangerous because you end up seeing pictures of civilians who've been killed and injured?
Well, we tend, when responding in this way, to be as precise as it is possible to be. It's worth drawing the contrast with the terrorist acts themselves, which were intended to destroy civilians and not the perpetrators of terrorism. But this mustn't be confined simply to targets in Afghanistan, because we know enough about the involvement of Iraq and other countries in the support of terrorism to know where we should strike back, and it is not just Afghanistan.
Well, I think there will be some hunkering down, frankly, because we will find ourselves obliged to make certain additional security precautions and certain additional infringements upon civil liberties and personal freedoms that I find very regrettable. But this is precisely, I think, what the terrorists are about. Changing America, not just frightening it, but changing it, defeating it.
Against rogue countries like Iraq and Iran.
It wouldn't have helped today.
It wouldn't have helped, but this event emphasized that there are certain countries in the world, North Korea, Iraq, Iran, maybe Gaddafi, maybe one or more else, that are ready to threat the world order by using whatever they have.
Up until now, the United States has often taken a quasi-legalistic approach to hunting down terrorists. You may remember after the attack on the US Navy ship off Yemen, they sent in the FBI agents, they look for evidence, they try and build up a case, bring them to trial. This is a very difficult approach when coming to deal with terrorists, because the terrorists do not leave a trail that is easily recognizable. So the United States has a second option. It can say, well, we identify various terrorist organizations in the Middle East and elsewhere who are responsible for these kind of acts. Osama bin Laden is one of those, and we will go after them whether or not we have direct evidence of that organization's link to this outrage or not. And then the United States will be faced with a decision: does it only go after Osama bin Laden, or does it widen this into a war against international terrorism, which would involve attacking more groups than Osama bin Laden? The third and final question that the Americans are going to ask themselves, and which Mr. Bush hinted at, is whether they are going to go after the states that support the terrorists, that provide them with the infrastructure and the base in which to act.
It certainly appeared he was widening the net there when he said no distinction would be made between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them. And as Tom Carver mentioned, that includes a whole range of countries.
That includes a whole range of countries, but within that range of countries, some are easier targets than others. You may recall that President Clinton launched various missile attacks at Afghanistan and Sudan following the terrorist attacks on the embassies in East Africa. And it's possible that they will do this again. But there are another range of countries which were mentioned by Mr. Pearl earlier in your broadcasts. He mentioned countries such as Iraq, Iran and Syria. Now, if the United States wishes to go after these countries, well, then we are looking at a different order of problem, because these countries can fight back, unlike Afghanistan and Sudan. The question becomes then is how far the United States is prepared to take that in order to eradicate international terrorism, if this is at all possible. A campaign of many years involving a whole range of operations will have to be undertaken.
What we've heard is that Israeli tanks have now entered Jenin. They are in the center of town. As you mentioned, there are heavy exchanges of gunfire. It's not clear how long they're going to stay or what they're going to do, but in the past they have destroyed buildings belonging to the Palestinian Authority infrastructure, in particular police stations and security offices.
Is this coincidental with what's been taking place in the United States, or is there a connection somehow?
There's not necessarily a connection. As you mentioned, the tanks have sealed off the town since about 24 hours, and the army said it was doing that in response to a suicide bombing in Israel. It says that in the Jenin area there are Islamic militant groups that are responsible for a number of suicide bombings in Israel, and they don't want to let any more bombers through. Also, the Israelis have, over the past 11 months of conflict, several times they have temporarily reoccupied Palestinian territory. The key thing is how long they stay. That usually is an indication of how serious the incursion is. However, we do have indications that the Israelis are ready to take tougher action against the Palestinians in the wake of the U.S. terror attacks. Government sources have said to us that Israeli officials sent strong messages to the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, telling him to put a categorical end to the violence, saying that the U.S. terror attacks showed that the violence could get out of hand. And I think this is an indication that the Israelis would like their conflict, their battle against the Palestinian militants to be seen as part of an international fight against terrorism, not as part of an attempt to put down a revolt against occupation, which is what the Palestinians say. And if a Middle East group is implicated or blamed for the U.S. terror attacks, it's possible that the Israelis might get more sympathy for this view. This would, of course, be worrying to Palestinians, who would then fear that Israel might get an even freer hand to apply very harsh military and economic measures that are against not only the militants but also affect the population as well.
So in some sense, Barbara, there could be some kind of strategic advantage for Israel from this tragedy.
It's possible. I think it depends who's going to be blamed for the attack. If a Middle East group is blamed, therefore making Israel, the conflict in Israel connected to what happened in the United States, it's possible that Israel will get more sympathy for its fight against Palestinian militants, which will then be seen as part of a bigger picture. Even if a Middle East group isn't blamed, because these were suicide attacks in the United States, it's possible that Israel might get more sympathy for its battle against suicide bombers, and it's possible that the international community might take a harder line against Palestinian attacks, which might not be viewed, as the Palestinians say, as a fight against military occupation.
There's a lot of talk about these being kamikaze attacks, and hope that tomorrow the President is going to make a request to the Congress for an absolute declaration of war.
Yeah, but who would that be against?
Well, Osama bin Laden.
War on somebody. You declare a war on this one man?
Well, in fact, it's been done before. The third President of the United States, with the acquiescence of the 5th Congress, declared war against the Barbary pirates, who were terrorists. And of course, what we have now is the 43rd President, the 107th Congress. And there's absolutely nothing in the Constitution that says you can't declare war against Osama bin Laden. Further to that, it is not only the Taliban who have provided refuge to him, but also, when one looks at it, in neighboring Turkmenistan, this man has been given at least acquiescence, if not refuge. And so I know that people are looking there as well as Afghanistan.
The second thing I want to underline is something you mentioned earlier in your program. Namely, that those responsible are the people who carried out the act, who helped plan it, who helped finance it, who provided a safe haven, a place where people could make their plans and so on. In other words, a country that allows people to make plans like this is to be held responsible. We need to preempt when we see something that's happening.
All of us have heard this term preventive war since the earliest days of Hitler. I don't believe there is such a thing, and frankly, I wouldn't even listen to anyone seriously that came in and talked about such a thing. General Dwight Eisenhower.
Mr. Secretary, if you're talking about eliminating the source of this, that would seem to suggest military action by the United States.
Absolutely.
Acts of war by us. A, do we need a declaration of war? And B, if we get one, and it is against Osama bin Laden and his collaborators of one kind or another, should military strikes be carried out against states, Afghanistan for one, others?
We need to put people on notice that if they harbor terrorists, they are going to get it from us. No place to hide.
And we have to make a statement that is so strong that any country that harbors, that trains, that gives money to, that supports, becomes an enemy of the civilized world. Because if this can happen here, it can happen in other places. Terrorism, as our report will say very shortly, isn't a crisis, it's an ongoing condition. And we've got to change the condition.
I mean, there's a great certainty among many people about where the fingers point. But ultimately, we don't want to be a terrorist ourselves.
The state that harbors them is as responsible as those who commit it. Therefore, are those civilians in peril?
Yes, they are. The powers that be in those nations have put them in peril. Saddam uses his civilians, as we know. There's no way around that, but we've got to face up to it. I agree with Diane that the greatest deterrent that we can have is the knowledge in the minds of potential terrorists around the world that there will be swift, accurate retribution. Unfortunately, there's just no way around that.
Sure there was. Treat this like a crime. and use the police of the world to help us.
I mean, the number of threats coming in from Osama bin Laden, not just Osama bin Laden, but other organizations against the United States, is a continuing flow of information. There probably has not been a day in the last 10 years when there were not terrorist threats made against the United States somewhere in the world.
It seems that the U.S. must be doing something wrong all over the world.
We can get an indication of the feeling of the Muslims worldwide by the fact that if you go to Baghdad or you go to Jerusalem today, you'll find that people are celebrating in the streets. That will indicate to you that there is a feeling of retribution or revenge against American atrocities being committed at the present time in the Middle East.
American atrocities?
American atrocities being committed. For example, their continued support of the tyrant state of Israel, the continuing bombing of Iraq, the unilateral bombing indeed a few years ago of Sudan and Afghanistan. We have a long list of atrocities which America have committed, which are enough for the Muslims and the Islamic movements worldwide to consider that they are in fact in a state of war with the American government.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, it seems this has come about because it's payback time for America's foreign policy.
Yes, that may be the case, but I think one of the things that does stand out today has been the number of messages flowing in from the Arab world, from all over the Arab world, and from Mr. Arafat himself, deploring this incident, condemning this as an outrage, and really dismissing any participation in this by the Palestinians. So I think that's an encouraging sign.
We have no word from the Israeli army about why they've decided to go into Jenin now, some 24 hours after they encircled the town, blocking all the roads in and out of it, saying that they wanted to prevent further suicide bombers coming out of Jenin after an Israeli Arab who was responsible for a suicide bombing attack in Israel on Sunday was accused by the Israelis of hiding in the town.
Has there been any word from the Israeli authorities as to who they think will have been responsible for the outrage in the United States?
No, there hasn't at the moment. What the Israelis are saying is that the attacks in the United States prove the need for an international war against terrorism, and they are prepared to help fight it. They say, we understand that the CIA has already contacted Israeli intelligence officials and are asking for their help in tracking down the perpetrators. But Israel is now on a high state of alert. We understand that land borders have been closed. The Israeli authorities have ordered that no foreign plane should fly in or out of the country, and the Red Cross also, the Israeli Red Cross is on, or it's actually the Red Star here is on a high state of alert.
The United States, to be fair, has criticized Israel for escalating the crisis in the Middle East by its responses to Palestinian terrorist attacks. But I think the United States will follow a different path. I think they will escalate. The United States has to respond. It has to show its domestic population that it will react. No population in a democracy can tolerate being attacked in this way, and the United States will respond. There are many countries in the Middle East and elsewhere, many organizations that are at this moment extremely fearful. The United States, I don't think, has decided on an option, but if we use the Pearl Harbor analogy, once the United States decides, it will act ruthlessly and effectively and will deal with this terrorist threat to the best of its capability.
I think it can go beyond harboring. The President said harbor, but I think those who finance them, those who train them, any of these countries, this is a new chapter tonight, and whatever may have been the policy in the past, the action today, I think, has changed that forever.
Colonel David, line them up and kill them, hunt again.
I don't think it's enough to take out an organization. You have to do the country and the people. There's no question, Saudi Arabia's involved, clearly Afghanistan's involved, but we've got state-sponsored terrorism. This was such a well-planned deal. I would find it difficult to believe that this was done by just a terrorist organization. This takes inside information. This takes a lot of planning and pinpoint execution.
Colonel David Hunt, let me ask you, if it is state-sponsored terrorism, I mean, not even sponsored, state-involved or state-countenanced or state-aware terrorism, is what you heard the President saying tonight, that we would make no distinction between those who carried out these deeds and those who harbored them, does that mean we rain bombs down on some countries?
I mean, are we mad enough now to do what we need to do? and it unleashed the dogs of war.
I guess I wonder if we hit too hard, and especially hit the wrong people, if we're not creating a new generation of children and grandchildren of these new martyrs, and that's how they'll be portrayed, who will then come back and kill our grandchildren. In other words, when does the cycle of violence stop? When do we stop, keep hitting them, and they hit us? When do we finally say the insanity has to stop worldwide?
Well, yes, but the argument is we haven't hit. Well, I'll tell you what, Monsignor, hang with us just a second. We'll discuss this on the other side.